Fort Campbell, Back 40, Kentucky, March 1987. The night vision goggles showed nothing but static, but Sergeant First Class Rex Bouchard could hear something massive breathing in perfect unison with his own heartbeat, staying exactly 3 steps behind his patrol, no matter how they changed direction. I am the War Maestro, and tonight I bring you a tale from the classified archives where elite soldiers discovered that advanced military technology means nothing when something ancient decides to hunt you. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment had activated at Fort Campbell 3 weeks earlier, but something was already hunting in the Kentucky darkness. Sergeant First Class Rex Bouchard felt eyes boring into his back as he led Bravo Company deeper into 12,000 acres of wilderness that soldiers whispered about in hushed tones. The Back 40 had claimed 3 equipment caches, spooked entire guard shifts, and driven seasoned veterans to request immediate transfers after encounters they refused to discuss. Bouchard's Louisiana drawl cracked slightly as he keyed his radio. Base, Recon 7 beginning sweep. Grid Tango 47 through 5-2. His grandfather's swamp tracking instincts screamed danger, but military protocol demanded he continue the mission. Behind him, twigs snapped in perfect rhythm with their footsteps. Something was mirroring their movement from the tree line. Specialist Kira Volkov's veterinary training had taught her to recognize predator behavior, but nothing in her textbooks explained the wrongness saturating these woods. Wildlife had abandoned the area entirely. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no insect hum. Just suffocating silence that pressed against her eardrums like a physical weight. Her hands trembled as she checked equipment that suddenly felt inadequate against whatever lurked beyond their vision. Corporal Tyson Blackwood brought up the rear, his grandfather's warnings echoing like prophecy. The Crow Elder had described creatures that learned human patterns, studied weaknesses, planned attacks with terrifying intelligence. Blackwood's skin crawled as he realized something was conducting reconnaissance on them, analyzing their formation, their weapons, their psychological state. The massive oak lay across their path like a deliberate message. No storm had felled this giant. Something had twisted it until the heartwood screamed and surrendered. Fresh claw marks gouged impossibly deep showed a grip span that defied classification. Volkov's breath hitched as she traced furrows that required thousands of pounds of crushing force. But the tree's placement was what made Bouchard's blood freeze. It created a perfect funnel, forcing any patrol into a narrow corridor where escape routes disappeared. This wasn't random destruction. It was battlefield engineering by something that understood military tactics better than most soldiers. Blackwood's radio hissed with static before his whisper cut through. "Sarge, we're being watched. Multiple positions, coordinated movement. Whatever did this is still here." The wind shifted, carrying a stench that bypassed rational thought and triggered pure animal terror. Wet fur mixed with something ancient and wrong, a smell that whispered of caves where human bones littered the floor. All 3 soldiers felt their training fracture as primordial instincts screamed one message: run. Something massive crashed through the underbrush 50 meters to their left, then again to their right, then behind them. They were surrounded by coordinated movement that suggested pack intelligence, but the spacing indicated creatures of impossible size. Bouchard's night vision flickered as shapes moved beyond its range, always just outside detection, always watching, always learning. Dawn brought no relief to Fort Campbell's Back 40. Specialist Kira Volkov sat hunched over audio equipment in the temporary command post, her veterinary background screaming warnings as she analyzed recordings from the previous night's patrol, the headphones pressed against her ears like a confession booth for nightmares. The first anomaly hit her at timestamp 0312 hours, a low rumbling that registered frequencies impossible for any known North American predator. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the spectrogram, revealing vocal patterns that plunged below 20 Hz, deep into infrasound ranges that bypassed conscious hearing and triggered primal terror directly in the human brainstem. But frequency analysis was just the beginning of her horror. The creature's breathing had indeed synchronized with Bouchard's heartbeat. But the recordings revealed something far more disturbing. It wasn't mimicking their respiratory patterns, it was anticipatory, adjusting its own breathing patterns to match theirs moments before they changed pace. Whatever stalked them possessed adaptive intelligence that suggested careful observation of human behavior. Volkov's hand shook as she isolated a 20-minute segment where motion sensors had captured methodical sniffing sounds. The creature spent exactly 18 minutes investigating their abandoned equipment cache, cataloging each item with the thoroughness of a forensic investigator. Thermal imaging showed it examining their gear from multiple angles, learning the soldiers' preferences, their weaknesses, their tactical limitations. The veterinarian in her recognized predator behavior, but this transcended anything in her training. Wild animals investigated scents to identify prey. This thing was conducting systematic reconnaissance. Colonel Martinez leaned over her shoulder, his coffee breath mixing with the stale air of sleepless panic. "What am I looking at, specialist?" Volkov's voice cracked as she pointed to the audio waveform. "Sir, at 0347 hours, listen to this." She pressed play, and the speakers filled with a sound that made both soldiers instinctively step backward. A guttural howl, so powerful it registered on seismic equipment 3 miles away. But the truly terrifying aspect wasn't the volume. The howl carried harmonic undertones that suggested vocal structures unlike anything in the fossil record. More disturbing still, wilderness microphones across 12,000 acres captured the immediate response. Absolute silence. Every coyote, every owl, every insect went completely quiet, as if nature itself held its breath in recognition of an apex predator that transcended the food chain. Martinez gripped the table edge until his knuckles whitened. How big would something have to be to produce that kind of vocalization? Volkov's veterinary calculations painted a picture that violated everything she knew about mammalian biology. Based on lung capacity and vocal stress analysis, we're looking at something with respiratory capabilities far exceeding any known terrestrial predator. The acoustic pressure alone suggests massive internal structures designed specifically for long-range communication. The final piece of evidence made her question her own sanity. Hidden in the background static, barely audible even with enhancement, were repetitive rhythmic patterns, purposeful acoustic sequences that suggested attempted communication rather than random animal vocalizations. Something in the Kentucky wilderness was testing sound frequencies, learning human response patterns through systematic acoustic experimentation, as if it was studying them with the patience of a field researcher, documenting behavior for future exploitation. Corporal Tyson Blackwood's grandfather had warned him about creatures that thought like generals, but nothing prepared him for what drone reconnaissance revealed across the back 40s terrain. Standing in the command tent 3 days after Volkov's audio discoveries, he stared at aerial photographs that made his blood run cold with recognition. The fallen trees weren't random destruction, they were tactical masterpieces. Every downed oak, every snapped pine, every demolished communication tower formed part of an intricate battlefield modification that would make Sun Tzu weep with admiration. The creature had systematically eliminated overwatch positions, created natural funnels that channeled patrols into predetermined kill zones, and established sightline blockages that turned the soldiers' superior firepower into a liability. Blackwood traced the pattern with a trembling finger. "It's hurting us." like wolves driving caribou, but using military doctrine. Colonel Martinez studied the photographs with growing horror. 60-year-old trees lay precisely positioned to force patrols through narrow corridors where escape routes disappeared. The physics alone defied comprehension. Each tree required over 3,000 pounds of crushing force applied, yet the placement showed mathematical understanding of tactical advantage that surpassed most West Point graduates. But the engineering extended beyond simple destruction. Motion-activated cameras captured the creature, modifying terrain during successive nights, always improving its tactical position. It demolished observation towers that provided overwatch capabilities, severed underground communication cables that connected remote outposts, and knocked down trees in geometric patterns that created perfect ambush positions. Most disturbing was the evidence of learning. Each night's modifications built upon previous work, suggesting the creature analyzed human responses and adapted its strategy accordingly. When soldiers adjusted patrol routes to avoid fallen timber, the creature responded by creating new obstacles that forced them back into predicted patterns. Sergeant First Class Rex Bouchard entered the tent carrying field reports that made the situation exponentially worse. His Louisiana accent thickened with stress as he delivered intelligence that shattered any remaining hope of conventional solutions. "Sir, we've got systematic equipment failure across 17 different positions. Night vision, thermal imaging, communications gear, all developing the same malfunction pattern. Static interference that peaks exactly when patrols reach the creature's modified terrain." The reports painted a picture of technological warfare that transcended animal intelligence. The creature wasn't just physically altering the battlefield, it was conducting electronic countermeasures that disabled human advantages at precisely the right moments, as if it understood not just military tactics, but the technology that supported them. Blackwood's tribal heritage provided the only framework for understanding what they faced. His grandfather's stories described Kahwahye as creatures that learned by observation, that studied human weaknesses before striking. But even those ancient warnings hadn't prepared him for something that combined apex predator instincts with general-level strategic thinking. The final piece of evidence arrived via helicopter from the base's engineering corps. Soil analysis from the creature's work sites revealed compression patterns that painted an impossible picture. Whatever was modifying their battlefield weighed approximately 400 pounds, but applied force with the efficiency of industrial machinery. More terrifying still, the compression patterns showed it was working systematically, following a predetermined plan that suggested weeks or months of advance reconnaissance. The creature had been studying Fort Campbell's operations long before the 160th SOAR's arrival, learning patrol patterns, equipment capabilities, and tactical doctrines with the patience of a career intelligence officer. Martinez crushed his coffee cup as the implications crystallized. They weren't facing a wild animal that had wandered into their training area. They were confronting something that had deliberately chosen Fort Campbell as a hunting ground, something that understood military organization well enough to dismantle it piece by piece. Outside the tent, trees crashed in the distance as the creature continued its nocturnal engineering projects, reshaping their world into a predator's paradise where human technology meant nothing and elite training provided no salvation. The back 40 was becoming a killing field designed by something that thought like a general but hunted like a wolf. The radio crackled to life at 23:47 hours with a transmission that made Colonel Martinez's skin crawl. Static cleared to reveal Specialist Davis reporting in from Outpost Charlie, his voice steady and professional, except Davis had been missing for 36 hours. "Base, this is Outpost Charlie. All secure, conducting normal patrol sweep. Weather conditions optimal for night operations." Martinez grabbed the microphone with white knuckles. "Davis, confirm your current grid position and personnel count." The response came back flawlessly, using Davis's exact speech patterns and vocal inflections. But when Martinez asked for authentication codes, the transmission cut to static. The creature had learned Davis's voice during his capture, but lacked access to classified protocols, a chilling reminder that it was studying them through direct observation of missing personnel. But the psychological warfare was just beginning. Throughout the night, radio chatter continued sporadically from soldiers who disappeared over the past week. Familiar voices conducted casual conversations about weekend plans, complaints about mess hall food, references to shared experiences that created the crushing illusion that their missing comrades were still alive somewhere in the Kentucky darkness. Volkov's veterinary knowledge provided no framework for what they were hearing. Certain birds could mimic human speech, but this transcended simple repetition. The creature was using recently observed vocal patterns to maintain conversations, responding appropriately to basic questions, while avoiding complex interactions that might reveal its limitations. The implications hit Blackwood like physical blows. His grandfather's warnings about shapeshifters took on horrifying new dimensions. If the creature could mimic voices it had recently heard, how many of their missing soldiers had been studied, recorded, then replicated for psychological warfare purposes? Sergeant Bouchard's Louisiana nerves finally snapped when he heard his own voice reporting completion of a reconnaissance mission he'd never undertaken. The transmission had originated from grid coordinates, where thermal imaging showed nothing but empty forest. The creature was using his vocal patterns to communicate false intelligence, potentially feeding misinformation into their operational planning. Sleep became impossible as soldiers questioned recent radio transmissions, wondering which communications had been authentic and which had been the creature testing their responses. The thing stalking them had weaponized their communication systems, turning basic military protocols into instruments of psychological torture. By dawn, paranoia infected the entire unit like a virus. Soldiers stared at each other with suspicion, wondering if recent conversations they remembered had actually occurred, or if the creature had been practicing vocal mimicry during brief encounters with isolated personnel. The final psychological blow came when Volkov analyzed recorded transmissions from the previous 72 hours. Audio pattern recognition revealed that several communications during night shifts had originated from the same source. Vocal cords capable of replicating recently heard human speech with disturbing accuracy. The creature hadn't just been hunting their personnel, it had been capturing them long enough to record their voices, then using that acoustic intelligence to infiltrate their communication networks and study their operational procedures from within. Trust, the foundation of military effectiveness, crumbled under the weight of impossible vocal deception that turned every familiar voice into a potential threat. The creature began using their own voices against them at 0200 hours, and by dawn, 3 soldiers had requested psychiatric evaluation. Private Johnson was found catatonic in his bunk, clutching a radio that broadcast his mother's voice calling his name from the tree line. The transmission originated from coordinates where thermal imaging showed nothing but empty forest, yet the voice carried intimate details about his childhood that existed nowhere in military records. Specialist Volkov's scientific rationality shattered when her radio crackled with her deceased father's voice, speaking in veterinary terminology about predator behavior patterns she'd never shared with anyone. The voice described her childhood fear of wolves with accuracy that bypassed all logical explanation, reaching into memories she'd buried for decades. But Corporal Blackwood faced the most insidious psychological assault. His grandfather's voice emerged from the static, speaking in Crow dialect about ancient warnings, but the words were wrong. Twisted versions of tribal legends that painted humans as prey animals designed for hunting. The creature had corrupted his cultural heritage, weaponizing ancestral wisdom into instruments of terror. Colonel Martinez watched his unit disintegrate as paranoia metastasized through the ranks like psychological gangrene. Soldiers refused radio contact, convinced that every transmission might be the creature manipulating their minds. Guard duty became impossible when sentries couldn't trust their own ears, when familiar voices calling for help might be predatory lures designed to isolate victims. The breaking point arrived when Sergeant Bouchard heard his 8-year-old daughter's voice pleading for help from the darkness beyond the perimeter fence. Every paternal instinct screamed at him to investigate, to rescue, to respond. But rational thought reminded him that his daughter lived safely in Louisiana, 1,500 miles from Kentucky. The creature's psychological warfare transcended simple mimicry. It was conducting deep probe intelligence operations into their most protected emotional vulnerabilities, accessing memories that should have been impossible to obtain, exploiting family connections that existed in classified personnel files. Sleep deprivation weaponized their fear as exhausted minds struggled to distinguish reality from auditory hallucinations. Soldiers began questioning their own memories, wondering if conversations with loved ones had actually occurred, or if the creature had been impersonating family members for months through telephone networks. Medical personnel reported a 70% increase in anxiety disorders, panic attacks, and requests for emergency leave. The creature wasn't just hunting individual soldiers, it was systematically destroying unit cohesion by eroding the trust and communication networks that held military organizations together. But the most terrifying realization came when Blackwood analyzed the creature's vocal deception patterns through his grandfather's traditional teachings. Crow legends described Kawaya as creatures that learned not just human speech, but human souls, entities that could reach into a person's deepest memories and fears, then use that knowledge to destroy them from within. The creature wasn't simply mimicking voices. It was conducting psychological autopsies on living victims, dissecting their emotional architecture to identify the precise pressure points that would cause complete mental breakdown. As night fell once again over the back 40, soldiers huddled in groups, afraid to be alone with their radios, terrified that the next familiar voice might be the one that finally shattered their sanity completely. At 0347 hours, the creature made its fatal mistake. It used Colonel Martinez's voice to order a general evacuation, while Martinez stood directly beside the radio operator in the command tent. The psychological spell shattered like breaking glass. For the first time in days, the soldiers had caught their tormentor in an undeniable error, proof that even this apex predator's intelligence had limitations. The creature's overconfidence in its vocal mimicry had finally betrayed it. Corporal Blackwood's tribal heritage suddenly transformed from cultural burden into tactical advantage. His grandfather's warnings about Kahwaye included one crucial weakness. The wolfmen required extensive observation periods to perfect their vocal theft, meaning they established predictable den sites near their hunting grounds. Using traditional crow tracking methods combined with modern thermal imaging, the team triangulated heat signatures in a limestone cave system beneath the back 40. The creature had been living directly underneath their training area for months, studying every movement, every voice, every weakness with the patience of a career intelligence operative. But as they approached the cave entrance, Sergeant Bouchard's radio crackled with his daughter's voice once again, pleading for rescue from the darkness. This time, however, He recognized the subtle vocal stress patterns that revealed mechanical mimicry rather than genuine emotion. The creature was repeating recorded audio clips, not generating real-time conversation. The psychological hold over his unit was breaking. Colonel Martinez deployed his remaining soldiers in standard cave-clearing formation, but nothing in their training had prepared them for what emerged from the limestone depths. The creature stood 8 feet tall, its muscular frame combining the bulk of a grizzly bear with the lean efficiency of a timber wolf. Coarse, fur-covered skin that seemed to absorb infrared light, making thermal targeting nearly impossible. But the true horror lay not in its physical presence. It was the unmistakable intelligence burning behind yellow eyes that reflected their tactical lights like molten gold. This wasn't some mindless beast, driven by hunger or territorial instinct. The creature studied their formation, calculated their fire angles, and demonstrated tactical awareness that rivaled their own military training. Specialist Volkov's veterinary background provided no classification for what they faced. The creature's proportions violated everything she understood about mammalian evolution, yet it moved with fluid grace that suggested millions of years of predatory refinement. DNA analysis would later reveal genetic markers from wolves, bears, and an unknown primate species that shouldn't coexist in nature. The firefight lasted exactly 17 minutes of pure terror. Multiple rifle rounds found their target, proving the creature's mortality despite its supernatural abilities. As it collapsed, dark blood pooled beneath fur that seemed to shift color in their tactical lights, creating the illusion of a dying shadow rather than flesh and bone. But the creature's final act carried one last psychological assault. As life faded from those intelligent eyes, its throat produced a cacophony of stolen voices, every soldier's vocal patterns broadcasting simultaneously in a grotesque symphony of identity theft that seemed to mock their victory, even in death. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound they'd endured, pregnant with implications that would haunt their dreams for decades. They had killed something that challenged every assumption about intelligence, evolution, and the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. The military classified the entire incident within 48 hours, transferring all witnesses to different installations across the continental United States before the creature's blood had finished staining the limestone cave floor. Official reports declared the events a training accident involving aggressive wildlife, but the survivors carried evidence that would haunt them for decades. Corporal Blackwood secretly preserved plaster casts of the massive bipedal footprints and audio recordings of the impossible vocalizations, storing them in a safety deposit box alongside his grandfather's warnings about creatures that walked between worlds. The old Crow medicine man stories had proven prophetic in ways that challenged regional assumptions about Kentucky's wilderness inhabitants. Colonel Martinez received a promotion and immediate reassignment to Fort Bragg, where classified incident files revealed similar encounters at remote military training areas across the Southeast. Installations in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia reported wildlife interference events during the 1980s that followed familiar patterns: systematic equipment failures, missing personnel, and large predators that demonstrated tactical awareness beyond normal animal behavior. But the most disturbing revelation came 6 months later, when base security reviewed motion sensor data from the closed Back 40 area. Trail camera footage showed evidence of something large and bipedal moving through the restricted zone, following old patrol routes with systematic precision that suggested intimate knowledge of human traffic patterns. Specialist Volkov completed her service and returned to veterinary practice, but her dreams remained haunted by yellow eyes that burned with unsettling intelligence. She established contact with cryptozoology researchers investigating similar encounters near military installations throughout Appalachia, collecting testimonies from soldiers who'd experienced comparable psychological warfare campaigns. The DNA samples from the creature's blood revealed genetic anomalies that defied standard classification systems. Laboratory analysis showed cellular structures containing unidentifiable markers, hybrid characteristics that suggested evolutionary adaptation in isolation, possibly within the extensive cave systems beneath Kentucky's limestone geology. Most unsettling was the discovery that the creature's vocal apparatus contained specialized structures similar to those found in lyrebirds and mockingbirds, but arranged in configurations that allowed for precise acoustic mimicry of human speech patterns. It hadn't learned voices through practice. It was biologically equipped for vocal replication through evolutionary development. Sergeant Bouchard retired early and returned to Louisiana's Bayou country, where his grandfather's Cajun folklore suddenly provided disturbing context for their encounter. Regional legends spoke of rougarou that studied human communities before striking, patient predators that learned behavioral patterns through careful observation rather than supernatural omniscience. The Back 40 remained permanently closed to training operations, officially due to terrain instability, but automated security systems continued detecting large bipedal heat signatures throughout the restricted area. Night shift personnel reported occasional familiar voices calling from beyond the perimeter fence, voices that matched personnel who'd rotated out weeks earlier. And in Colonel Martinez's final classified report, a single observation summarized their encounter with something that challenged assumptions about intelligence, adaptation, and the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. We killed one creature in that cave system, but motion sensors suggest the limestone networks beneath Fort Campbell may contain additional specimens. The question isn't whether more exist, it's whether they learned from watching us kill the first one. If the sounds from Kentucky's darkness still echo in your mind, it's time to enlist in our classified operations. Listen carefully to the silence around you right now. Make sure you don't hear any familiar voices calling your name. Subscribe to the War Maestro Archive to access more encounters where elite soldiers face the impossible. Hit that notification bell. You'll want to know when our next classified horror surfaces from the depths of military secrecy. Share this account with fellow seekers of battlefield nightmares who understand that the most terrifying enemies aren't always human. The War Maestro's vault contains decades of encounters where training means nothing and technology fails. Remember, something is still moving through those Kentucky caves.